Now I know, she said, that other more serious cause of your sickness. You have forgotten what you are. So I really understand why you are ill and how to cure you. For because you are wandering, forgetful of your true self, you grieve that you are on exile and stripped of your goods. Since indeed you do not know the goal and end of all things, you think that evil and wicked men are fortunate and powerful. Since indeed you have forgotten what sort of governance the world is guided by, you think these fluctuations of fortune uncontrolled. All of these are quite enough to cause not merely sickness, but even death. But I thank the author of all health that you have not yet wholly lost your true nature.
Ho-ri-o-ho, 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 ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we are reading Boethius' book, The Consolation of Philosophy.
Is this a book you like?
Is this a book I like? You know, I don't even know. I don't know how I feel about this book. It's an interesting book. It's an interesting book to sit and think with. I don't think I've enjoyed the process of reading the entire book, though there are definitely parts of it I like.
You've read it a bunch of times, right?
I've read it a few times. I don't remember the first time I read it. I don't know if I read it before I read it for a class that, we've talked about a few times, a class on the history of literature that you were teaching and I was TAing back when I was in grad school. You assigned Consolation of Philosophy. I know that I read it then because I had to lead a little lecture thingy on it. But I don't remember whether I'd read it or if I just dipped into it before then. I mean, the description of the book as this interesting combination of poetry and prose and philosophy and autobiography, like it's compelling on paper. And then I read it and I'm just not sure how to deal with this kind of philosophy that I'm not sure I agree with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I also know that you've read this book a lot and I think you like it.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting phenomenon. I have read it a whole bunch of times. The first time I read it, I think I was in graduate school, and I remember it super vividly because it was the very first term I was in graduate school, and it was the very first presentation I gave, and so that whole sort of, I don't know, I guess kind of trauma of putting this all together and then speaking in front of a group and so on. I remember this really vividly, and I kind of fell in love with the book. I just was really drawn into it, and in the years since then, I read it many times, taught it many times, and I've been fascinated to see the way in which it provokes a certain kind of response. 9 out of 10 readers, so if you teach it in a class, they're like, this is fine. And they are interested in what you were describing, like the fact that in terms of genre, it's like, where does this book even go? And the fact that this is a book that comes from a very different world, sort of at the very end of the waning period of the Roman Empire, but sort of before you really get into the heyday of the Middle Ages. It comes from an odd in-between time. So they're like, oh, this is fine. But there's always a few in the class, like maybe 5-10% who are like, this is fantastic. This is one of the best books I ever read. This book changed my life. And I'm not even exaggerating. I had students say this, and I got really fascinated by it. I'm like, what is it about this book that even though it's more than, it's like, I don't know, 1,500 years old, right, provokes this kind of response in readers. And so that's interesting. And for myself, I wouldn't say it's a book that changed my life, but it's a book I find very beautiful. I think there's some passages in it that are just gorgeous. So that's the button pushing part for me. That, and it's a book that speaks to many other books, and I love it, that web of interconnection. We've talked about it before.
Yeah, it has come up before. Boethius has showed up before. He makes an appearance in the Divine Comedy by Dante.
Mm-hmm.
I think he may have come up in a few other contexts as well. I can't remember, but he does show up all the time.
Yeah, for example, I think when we read Christine de Pizan's City of Ladies, when we talked about the personifications that appear to her at the very beginning, that was a Boethius moment. I'm pretty sure we flagged that.
Absolutely, because of course, philosophy is personified very strongly here. Yeah, it's a book that definitely feels like it has a lot of connections, both sort of historical. It influenced certain books and was influenced by books. This is a book that clearly wears the fact that it's, trying to do something in the vein of Plato very strongly, right? It's a very dialogic in that sense and about philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about somebody who is in jail and potentially, and in fact, actually about to die, about to be put to death, much like Plato's Apology. So you've got some obvious resonances in that direction. And then it's also a book that is well read in the Middle Ages and beyond, where you get, Chaucer doing a translation of it, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a whole bunch of people end up translating it, responding to it. Like we mentioned, Dante and Christine Pizan being really interested in it. Chaucer, like you said, translates it. There's even a translation that was done by Queen Elizabeth I. I mean, there's like it's a book that had tremendous legs, like through the Middle Ages, through the early modern period. And as you're saying too, it's got these roots that extend deep into antiquity. The dialogue format here is similar to in some ways, but also very different from the dialogues that we talked about when we did Plato's Symposium. So it's like, it's a book that, I don't know, it's almost like, you're in a building sometimes and there's like one of these nice reception rooms, hallways, that has doors and halls that go into many different places. It's a bit like that. It sits at the middle of many crossing ways, I think.
Well, so it's interesting, I think, that you first encountered this in grad school and fell in love with it there. I think it really works as an object to work with if you're in that kind of position, right? If you're the sort of person who's doing research and if you're trying to write about texts, this is a text you can write about.
Oh, sure.
Like there's a lot going on in a lot of different directions. And so it opens itself up to be an object of study for all of its various things it's trying to do in ways that it's quite different or quite unexpected in its context. And I guess also I wonder if the students who really fall for it, if the readers who really love it, I mean, do you have a sense of how many of them are buying into its philosophical argument, of its attempt to, portray a sense of what the good life is and how you need to sort of think your way out of a terrible situation?
The answer to that, I think, is really an interesting one. The students I recall having this kind of response to it were ones who were reading it in an undergraduate class. And I think what they were responding to was that kind of, you know how the philosophical commitments of the text change a lot. And we're going to talk about this from the opening books till you get into the later books. And it becomes increasingly abstract and increasingly, not just increasingly complex, but increasingly open to argumentation, philosophical argumentation. The earlier books are really about, you need to see the shape of your life in a different way. You need to understand what is valuable in your life and the fundamental underlying order of the universe, and you're a part of that order. And I think the people who respond like, this book changed my life, are responding to that. They're responding to books 1 through 3. And the ones who read further into books 4 and 5 are the ones who are going to be like, oh my God, this is a philosophical labyrinth. Right. I think, I could be wrong, but the ones who are responding in that really affective way, I think that what they're responding to is I don't know how to call it the hopefulness exactly, but the reassurance that there is an order in a world that appears to be chaotic.
Well, let's go quickly over the plot, so to speak, of the book. Boethius is sad at the beginning. He's real sad, and he's writing poetry about how sad he is. It's that bad. And it seems like he's got a good reason to be sad. He's in prison. He's in exile after some of his political machinations, all of which were done for the good of the people and in the fight for what's right, he's going to tell us. Anyway, this landed him in some hot water, and specifically in prison, and eventually he will be killed. But he doesn't know that as he's writing it. Although he might have an intimation of it. Anyway, the personification of philosophy herself joins him in his cell, and she shoos away all those poetic muses who are doing nothing to help Boethius out of his despair. Instead, she's going to try to remind Boethius of the philosophy that he seems to have forgotten, even though he studied it quite a lot. She's going to enact a kind of philosophical therapy that will explain his pain away and leave him with tools to better understand his position in the universe and in the body politic, and, more importantly, his relationship to philosophy itself and to the divine. And that sad poem that we started with is going to set the formal structure for the whole work, which alternates between poetry and prose, as if it were a kind of philosophical musical, where they suddenly break out into hymns every so often. By the second half of the book, philosophy's line of inquiry becomes more and more of a Platonic dialogue, but it's still broken up with the poems. And the book ends, to my mind, kind of abruptly, with philosophy having proved her points about what a good life entails, at least to Boethius' satisfaction. And so we're done. There's no ending.
No, you're absolutely right. The book is just, it leaves you in this kind of suspension. And the shape of the book, like the form of the book, reassures you that it's complete and that it's whole, but there's no closure. There's no tying up of the ends.
No, and what I should say is that the ending of the book is closure of the philosophical argument.
Mm-hmm.
That comes to what seems like a culmination about what you're supposed to do in life and how you should orient yourself in terms of what's really important. I don't know. That's oversimplification, but that's kind of the basic idea of it. And yet, once that's done, there's no next step. There's no scene of Boethius applying this. There's no sense of like, well, what's going to happen now with this guy who's in prison, his wife and his kids who are elsewhere, like all that stuff that's brought up early in the book when he's talking about his life and his situation is left behind.
Yeah, we might talk more about that closing. I feel like it's kind of cut off, by which I don't mean that the ending is missing or anything like that, but that there's a kind of terminus, like almost like you get to, you're on a train, you get to the train station, it just stops. It's a bit like that. And I think you're right. The philosophical argument has come to a close. And we're on the threshold of something else. And so in physical terms, we're on the threshold of his execution.
Right.
I mean, historically, right? So maybe that's a way to kind of signal that. But we're also on the threshold of how far philosophy can go. And this is a point she's going to make in book 5 when Boethius is asking her a question about some point. And she says, well, to answer that, it's really a theological matter. I mean, she doesn't say it in quite these words, but it's basically to answer that question, you need theology, and I'm philosophy, right? So that terminus effect, I think, is really intentional.
I think that's also a good point to make this early on, is that this is a philosophical text and it understands itself as being part of a philosophical tradition that goes back to Plato and Aristotle, which is to say a pre-Christian one. And so even though Boethius has written about Christianity elsewhere, this book doesn't explicitly mention it at all. It mentions God quite a lot, but not any dogmatic doctrine.
No, God appears like in the sort of Neoplatonic sense of the driver of the universe, the force that kind of gets things going and keeps things running in ordered circles. And we'll talk about that. But this sort of specifically Christian theology, elsewhere in Boethius' writings, you're going to find that, but not at all here.
And that isn't to say that an understanding of the world through Christian lenses isn't informing the philosophy, but he's not being explicit about that.
It's purposeful. It's purposeful that he's not going to put it in that language. This is the language of philosophy, right? Which again, I think is one of the really cool features about it.
So Boethius tells us quite a lot about himself and his position in this text. How much of that is true?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say. I mean, we have information about him that comes from Roman governmental records because he was an important and influential citizen who participated as senator and as consul.
Now, wait, before we go further, we should say this is after the fall of Rome.
Well, it's complicated, right? It's like Rome has kind of fallen apart already some years before, and there's a sequence of, without getting into the woods here, there's like a sequence of rulers that kind of hold things together more or less. And he's part of that governmental system that is still carrying on the structures of Rome, like not in the city of Rome, but like the Western Empire. But it's increasingly falling to pieces.
Right.
So his full name, Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, and we just call him Boethius, born somewhere around 480, died in 524, which was when he was executed, as we've mentioned already.
Oh, God, he was younger than I am. Just did that math. Oh, no, I never thought about that before.
Sorry about that. So tumultuous political situation, which affected him as a young man. His father had a bad fate, and he ended up being adopted by another aristocratic family. But things sort of came together. He emerged into a politically prominent role, became known as a writer, historian, philosopher, married the daughter of the person who had adopted him, rose to prominence. Everything is really coming together for him. He set out this ambitious task of translating, commenting on, and reconciling all the works of Plato and Aristotle. I mean, I'm like, really, dude? Do you really think you could possibly do this? But whatever. It's good to have ambitions. And he's at the top of the world, more or less, in 522. This is 2 years before his death. His 2 sons had been appointed as consuls, and we know about this not just from what he tells us, but historically, which is a sort of ceremonial role, but a really important ceremonial role. He himself was in a administrative position in the government that gave him a certain amount of power. So he's kind of at the top of the world, we'd say. And then everything really falls apart. He's imprisoned the following year and then executed in 522. 24. And in the Consolation of Philosophy, he tells us his story. And when I say he tells us his story, you kind of want to disambiguate he, that is Boethius, the writer, the author of the Consolation of Philosophy, and Boethius, the kind of character who's, I don't want to say self-indulgent, but is really upset and feels aggrieved and wronged and is going to tell philosophy and tell us every last thing that was done badly to him. And so, in evaluating that account, you have to not only kind of take into account subjectivity, but also like the emotional response, right, that he's dramatizing almost in this opening book.
Yeah, I mean, he lays it on.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And he may well have a point. It's hard to say. Like he lays it on so thick that I don't trust it. Is my gut instinct, but that just might be me being cynical.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Anyway, so the one other thing I just want to say about him in the way of background, and we've kind of alluded to this already. He wrote a number of other works, but the Consolation of Philosophy is the one that went on to be hugely influential for two reasons. One, for some of the reasons we've already talked about. That is the literary qualities of it, the vividness of the personification, some very beautiful poetry in it, but also because the philosophical content was so valuable in a time when, especially during the earlier Middle Ages, a lot of philosophical works from antiquity were not accessible. So you get quite a lot of Plato and Aristotle by way of the Consolation. In addition to that, Boethius had done translations of some of Aristotle's other works, his categories, his book on interpretation, and his prior analytics, probably the most important ones. And these were, again, hot commodities, especially in the earlier Middle Ages. So he's an important figure for that. He also wrote a really neat treatise on mathematics that was a textbook, right through the Middle Ages into the early modern period, and a book on the history of music. And like we said before, also theological works, including a book on the Trinity. So he has these two very different bodies of work. One body of work that's philosophical and that's really substantial, and then a number of theological works that sort of sit side by side but don't cross paths. And somebody who's really had a lot of impact, even though the book, I think was most influential, translated, reworked up through the Middle Ages and the early modern period. And so it's not as visible in the later period, but it's visible in an ongoing way through the books it's affected. Like many writers who have responded to it and the way it's gotten kind of folded into the fabric of literary history. And like I said, the occasional student in a class who's like, oh my God, this book, I can't even believe it.
Wow.
I know, is that weird?
It is weird. Speaking of translations, he did a bunch, and there have been a few translations of the Consolation of Philosophy, but having looked over a good half dozen of them for this episode, I don't like any of them.
No. As somebody, because you're somebody whose Latin is good, what is it you're responding to? Like, where are they falling short? What do you feel in them?
I don't want to make it sound like I was going through the Latin with a fine-tooth comb. I did take a peek at it. My problem is that I didn't enjoy reading the English. Like, I didn't enjoy the poetry in any of them, and I didn't particularly enjoy the prose. A lot of the translations I was reading take this very elevated tone, which I suppose is appropriate.
Which is just, I don't know.
It's a little much.
It seems to me, I don't know. It's a way to try to reflect the grandeur of the subject matter, which is a really bad idea, I think. Because the text itself is, I don't know if colloquial is the right word, but there's a real conversational quality to the prose sections. And the poetry, like I said, I think is just beautiful.
I think it comes from a tradition of translating Plato, very high register, whereas I think Plato probably should be a lot lower, especially the earlier stuff, which is a lot funnier and more lively and vivacious.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't know enough about Boethius to know which era of Plato's writing he's going after, whether it's the sort of fun early stuff or whether it's the stodgier later works. I can't say. And when I looked over the poetry, it wasn't, I don't know. I didn't look at it enough to really have a sense of it. It didn't have the playfulness of Ovid, which also had this problem of not really having a good translation because, I don't know, the language is just so delightful in the original that it's tricky to translate. It also didn't have the sort of heft or weight of Virgil. So I wasn't quite sure what to be looking for in the poetry, and I didn't spend enough time with it to answer that question. It's entirely my fault. I'm not at all saying anything that's bad about the poetry in Latin. I just didn't spend the time with it to say.
Yeah. Well, so you know how there's the Loeb translations that give you the Latin on one side and they give you a very literal translation on the right. I like that one a lot because it's very, like I said, very literal, and it for the prose sections it gives you a sense of that conversational quality that I was just alluding to. So just to give an example, this is near the beginning of the Consolation of Philosophy. It's a prose section 2, so it's quite near the beginning of the first book. She says, "But," she said, "now is the time for cure rather than complaint." Then, gazing keenly and directly on me, she said, "Are you the same man who was once nourished with my milk, once fed on my diet, till you reached your full manhood? And did I not furnish you with weapons as would keep you steadfast and safe? Do you recognize me? Why do you say nothing? Were you silent because you were ashamed or stupefied? I should like to think that you were ashamed, but I can see that you are quite stupefied." And it goes on. I mean, there's this, and that's very literal, that translation. These short questions, this interrogation, like you would expect from how she'll identify herself a little later on, his old nurse.
Right.
So kind of authoritative, slightly bossy female character. And then in the poetry sections, it's interesting to unpack the different kinds of meter, the different kinds of metrical structures that get used, because there's a lot of variety. And there's a lot to say about that if you're looking closely at the Latin. But there's also, I think, a beautiful vividness to the poems that we might talk about.
Well, where shall we dive in?
It's hard to say. So we should say a little bit maybe about the structure and shape of the work,
Sure.
just because that is also a nice way into the poetry, I think. So it's in 5 books. And as you were mentioning earlier, the books are alternating prose and poetry. We kind of go back and forth. And this prose and poetry alternation, which is sometimes called prosometrum, becomes actually a format that's imitated in later medieval writers who think this is really cool. So Boethius kind of popularizes this mode. And the opening book, it's him and philosophy kind of getting acquainted, him telling his whole backstory, and her trying to introduce the cure that he's going to have to experience. They go on in conversation and explore the kind of forces out there that have made his life turn out the way it's turned out. And one big focus is on the role of fortune, like the wheel of fortune. You're at the top of the world 1 minute, and then everything completely goes to shit, right? So trying to make sense of that is a big preoccupation of book 2. And book 3, which is, the midway point, it's in 5 books, right? If you think about how we talked about the numbers game in Dante, how number is a way of understanding order, that's something that's really happening in Boethius too. So book 3 is kind of this midpoint. It's this kind of top of the circle in some sense, but also a kind of pivot around which the whole book turns. And all kinds of cool stuff happens in there, including one poem that gets seen as a kind of philosophical kind of core or kernel of the whole work, which is 3 meter 9, which is about the driver of the universe, what makes the universe work. You who keep everything in order. It's addressed to God. And then the other poem that appears in book 3, which I absolutely love, is at the end of book 3. It's 3 meter 12, which is a poem about Orpheus. And we talked about the myth of Orpheus in the past, I think, when we read Ovid's Metamorphoses. And this is a very idiosyncratic and very beautiful take on it. And books 4 and 5 are like philosophy, basically.
Yeah, they are. I mean, even the latter half of book 3 is a lot like that as well.
Yeah.
With Boethius just left saying, indubitably, like he's in a bad translation of Plato.
Well, but that's part of what's going on here too, right? Because I was saying it's kind of a bit circular in some ways, right? That the books 1 through 5, you got this 3 as this kind of top of the circle kind of thing. But there's also a linear progression, and that's Boethius getting his head together.
Right.
And that is articulated in terms of this really cool metaphor about sickness and health, and medicine. And the medicine that's going to make him better, philosophy talks about this quite a bit, is, on the one hand, it's the reasonable arguments that she's going to take him through. She's going to straighten his head out, right? She says, "You've forgotten who you are," and she's going to straighten this out. But it's also song, right? These beautiful, metrical, orderly, this combination of sound, voice, reason, right, in an orderly form is going to get his head together in another kind of way.
It's interesting because, of course, it begins with her casting out poetry.
Yeah, well, I love the translation. I don't know if the Loeb has this or not. The old version of the Loeb used to have it. They would translate the phrase, was it Scanicus meretriculus, as theatrical tarts.
Oh, that's nice.
Isn't that great?
Yeah. I saw a bunch of different translations for that phrase, and I didn't care for any of them, but that's a pretty good one.
I love that. I don't think it was in the revised Loeb, but I think it was in the old one.
So it's interesting that after that, they turn to, well, I think they refer to it as music as distinct from poetry, which is, I don't know what that meaning is in this context, but nevertheless, it is interesting that like there is a right and a wrong form of versification.
Mm-hmm. And that's why Orpheus fits into this too, right? I mean, he's the musician poet, right? Figure of the musician poet par excellence, right? And so he's part of that whole dynamic. Like, what is poetry for? Is it just a distraction from affairs of the mind, from philosophy, enlightenment and so on? Or is it actually the way there? And that's one of the things that's being played out in this book, right? The theatrical tarts. That's just, bullshit poetry. That's poetry. It's just self-indulgent. It's not getting you anywhere. But poetry can also lift you up in this transcendent way, right? It can take you, it can give your mind wings.
Right. Yeah. I guess it was just that you mentioned that the orderliness of it. And I'm thinking, well, the theatrical tart poetry is also quite orderly in the terms of it being metrical and so forth. But it's an inappropriate use of that order, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think it's a bit of a straw man, right? The theatrical tarts, right? It's way to say there's a right, like you said, a right way and a wrong way to do this. And I'm going to show you the right way. And the right way is one that combines philosophical logic, right? Reason, and also the power of language to move you and to lift you up. Right. And so, the first place we start to see this, I think, at least the first place I think it's really striking is when you get into book 2, meter 8. It's a poem about love. And you might be like, oh, love, that's the subject matter of the theatrical tarts, isn't it? I mean, that's just, that's about how people are drawn together and all that, like physical love and all that stuff. But philosophy is going to use this opportunity to talk about love in a different kind of way. Love, not just as something that lifts people up, but the driver of the whole universe. So she says this. She says, in regular harmony, the world moves through its changes. I'm going to skip a little bit. She says, what binds all things to order, governing earth and sea and sky, is love. If love's reign slackened, all things now held by mutual love would fall to warring with each other, striving to wreck that engine of the world, which now they drive in mutual trust with motion beautiful. And love joins peoples too by a sacred bond, and ties the knot of holy matrimony that binds chaste lovers. Joins too with its law all faithful comrades. O happy race of men, if the love that rules the stars may also rule your hearts. So it's like philosophical, right? This is about love as this kind of engine of the universe. And he's going to unpack that much more fully in book 3. And it doesn't leave out how people love one another, right? It joins people too, right? Chaste lovers, holy matrimony, faithful comrades, right? So it's a kind of, I don't know what to call it, a sort of a moralized vision of how people come together. But it involves human beings in this world as well as the cosmic order, right? So that's what I mean by like poetry being this quality to sort of take you up to some higher level. And the Orpheus story, which we're going to encounter in book 3, is going to show you how dangerous a spot that is, because right when you think you're on the verge of ascent is when things can fall apart.
I'm looking at the Latin of this as you're describing it to me, and I can't help but notice this poem about love and love structuring and regulating the world is written in very short lines, very short couplets that have a lot of repeated words, structural words. The first line begins with, quod mundus stabili fide, concordes variet vices, quod pugnantia semina foedas perpetuum tenet, quod foedas roseum diem curu purvehit aureo, etc. You got quod starting each one, which is both very structurally clear. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think the whole text is in fairly clear Latin. And it's also, it's appropriately philosophical and so forth. That you can see some ideas about these couplets being yoked together through similarity in the poem, where that seems to be part of the idea of how love functions in the world.
And then that closing kind of apostrophe, where it sort of turns out from this summary of the nature of things to sort of be oh, it's translated, "Oh, happy race of men," right? Turning out to humanity to enjoin them on doing something. So it's a very, like you're saying, very formally structured kind of poem, but with the capacity, I think, to spill over, which is going to get unpacked in the later poems in book 3.
I will say those last two lines also, just again, looking deeply at the Latin for a second, which I didn't do while reading it, and with really interesting sound play. So the lines, si vuestros animos amor, quoquilum regitur regat.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that nice?
So you got two very similar words ending each of the last two lines.
Yeah.
Anyway, you're listening to live Latin poetry appreciation.
Sorry about that. But no, it's quite lovely. And like I said, in book 3, there's a couple of other poems that I don't know if we'll look at them at length, but they both really repay spending some time with. 3 meter 9 is super famous because it's ended up being the focus of a lot of the Latin commentaries that were written on Boethius, which saw this poem, the one that starts out, O qui perpetua mundum, O you who in perpetual order govern the universe. They saw this as a kind of encapsulation of the message of the whole work. And so unpacking that poem was a way to kind of unpack the whole work. But it's also quite lovely and philosophically really interesting. And that totally repays time. But like I said before, the one that I really love is the Orpheus one.
Which better be good, because it's Orpheus.
It is. And it's kind of neat, too, because he's not going to give you the whole story of Orpheus. Like he's assuming you know the myth. And what we're going to get here instead is a little snapshot of the crucial moment in the story. So you remember from when we read Ovid's Metamorphoses, or people might run into the story of Orpheus in a lot of different places. He's this incredibly gifted poet, and he has a wife he is very attached to who dies and ends up in the underworld. And he really, really, really wants her back. And so he is able to go down into the underworld and play his lyre, play his music and his song for the gods of the underworld. So Hades and Persephone, and they're persuaded, and he's allowed to take her up, but it doesn't quite work out as the happy ending that he might have had. So this is the part where Hades changes his mind. Everyone becomes absolutely still as they hear Orpheus' song. Then, at last, we are overborne, in pity says the ruler of the shades. We grant the man his wife to go with him, bought by his song. Yet let our law restrict the gift, that while he Tartarus quits, he shall not turn his gaze. Who can give lovers laws? Love is a greater law unto itself. By the very boundaries of night, Orpheus' Eurydice saw, lost, and killed. To you this tale refers, who seek to lead your mind into the upper day. For he who, overcome, should turn back his gaze toward the Tartarian cave. Whatever excellence he takes with him, he loses when he looks on those below. So I think it's a really weird and cool poem. It's very beautiful in Latin, I think, especially that saw, lost, and killed line. I think is just gorgeous. But it's that turning point. Everything's coming together. Hades said, "Great, take her, go," and they're leaving. He's walking out. She's behind him. He can hear her footsteps. He knows he can't look back. But who can give lovers laws? Right? Can't help himself. And so he looks. She's gone. And in a sense, he's killed her, right? And so we see this kind of promising outcome, this catastrophic outcome, and then, the voice of the speaker, this is about you, which I think is such a great moment. You know that poem by Rilke, Archaic Torso of Apollo, where it's this beautiful description of this statue, and then it turns out and says to the reader, you must change your life. It's a bit like that.
That's interesting because, of course,
I don't know if this is true or not, but for me, this is like what turns me on about Boethius. The fact that he gives you this highly philosophical, highly learned thing, and it's philosophy and it's myth and all this, and then there's this like really affective thing where he's like pointing outward. It's like, you pay attention.
Right.
That for me, that just really turns me on. I love that.
But
you don't like that.
Well, see, the frustration here is that we've just argued, or we've just suggested that, I don't remember how it is in your translation, but who can for lovers laws indict? Who can put up a law saying
who can
that
give lovers laws?
Can't do things? Yeah. And yet it also ends with a admonition, lover, Don't look at your beloved. You can't do that. It's like, that doesn't seem right or nice. I don't know.
Well, I think it's like there's this stuff that's pulling you up and there's this stuff that's pulling you down.
Sure.
Right? And you're in between. And if you keep your eyes fixed on the thing ahead, it's all going to be okay. Right? I don't mean this like literally. I mean like there's a figurative way of understanding it. And that's the kind of suspension that's being unpacked here. How is it that you can recognize, who can give lovers laws, that there's this kind of constraint that's laid on people by the fact that they love, and love is packed into us as human beings. And yet at the same time, you have to not get dragged down by the materiality of the world, because reality isn't ultimately there, right? Reality is ultimately in this Platonic realm of forms, right? Like even leaving aside the theological commitments, right? I mean, for Boethius, right?
Right.
So it's, and it's not surprising that in the Middle Ages, when they're writing commentaries on this, they just really go to town with this. They just like, this is the best thing ever, because they use this line about the fabula, to you this tale refers, as a way of saying, yeah, all story is like this. This is the way all story works. And you get this kind of theory of fabula in the 12th century that basically unpacks the whole theory from those couple lines.
Oh,
it's so cool.
Interesting.
Oh yeah, it's super cool. Like the whole theory of allegory comes out of those couple lines.
That idea of the sort of you're up and then you're down arc also plays out in philosophy's description of fortune, who also gets personified and who philosophy takes the voice of for a bit, sort of personifies. Like it's a personification personifying another it's a wild moment.
Yeah, which is super cool, right? I always think like people sometimes think, oh, philosophy and fortune are both personified in this work, and it's like, yeah, kind of, except that fortune is personified in the sense that philosophy is like, fortune would say this.
Yeah.
Right? So it's very meta.
Yeah, it's not like the Book of the City of Ladies where there are several different personifications hanging out. No, this is one personification sock puppeting another. And it's very interesting how fortune is presented as somebody who, will lead you up and then tear you down and bring you back up again. And if you enjoy one part of the ride, you're sort of obliged to enjoy all of it.
Yeah.
Which, fair, I guess, fine, I suppose. I don't know. It feels like there are some people who never get to see the dizzying heights that this book doesn't quite acknowledge. But what are you going to do?
He's trying to rationalize it, like his life has turned to shit, right? He's trying to but it's really great when, like you said, philosophy is sock puppeting fortune. Sometimes she's just talking about fortune, but sometimes she actually inhabits fortune's voice, which is really cool. She says this to him. She says, you imagine that fortune's attitude to you has changed. You're wrong. Such was always her way. Such is her nature. All she's done in your case is remain constant to her own inconstancy. She was just the same when she was smiling, when she deluded you with the allurements of her false happiness. You've merely discovered the changing face of that blind power. She who still conceals herself from others has completely revealed herself to you.
Yeah.
Which is kind of neat, right? In other words, you should be glad you see her for what she is, because most people don't even know this.
Right. Yeah, this is some of the best argumentation in the book, from my perspective. Like,
yeah, it's very crisp.
It's very crisp, and I buy it in a sense. I might have some quibbles with it here and there, but like generally speaking, like this is, I don't know, the argumentation, the philosophical argumentation early in the book is compelling to me because it doesn't feel because the Platonism hasn't really kicked in yet in the overdrive that it will shortly. So this is all very exciting and it's very snappy, and there's also a real emotional heft to how and why philosophy is arguing this at this point in the book, right? You were talking about how your fortune is gone terribly, and here's the thing, is that you got to understand blah, 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 blah. So there's a real emotional heft to the fact that they're arguing, and it makes sense that he would hear this and reconsider his situation. So I like that. I don't know. I'll talk about the bits that maybe frustrate me a bit more later. But I do want to ask more about or talk more about personification, sort of how it plays out here, because we are introduced to philosophy. She shows up in the first sentence of prose, and he's thinking about the poem he just wrote where he was all sad, and then he sees a woman, and the woman is there, and describes the woman. We've done a bit about this. We get to see her garment, which has the letter pi and the letter theta for
Practical and theoretical.
Yeah, exactly. So you're supposed to figure out pretty quickly that this is philosophy we're talking to, and there's a bit of a who are you kind of moment, but never quite the sort of oh it's you philosophy, hey, like that moment that you get to see in Christine de Pizan.
Well, he can't see properly, right? And there's a lot going on there, right?
I suppose so. Yeah. It's just interesting that like this happens and sort of a big deal isn't made of it.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I found that really interesting.
Well, it's kind of, I mean, this is one of the things also that I really fell in love with, because I love this vividness of personification.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I really like allegory, right? So I was totally a sucker for this. And it's kind of neat. So she shows up, like you said, Boethius says, there seemed to stand above my head a woman. Her look filled me with awe. And he goes on to describe her physical appearance. It was hard to say how tall she was, he says, because at one time she seemed to confine herself to the ordinary measure of man. But at another, the crown of her head touched the heavens. Her dress was made of very fine and perishable thread of delicate workmanship. She herself wove it, as I learned later, for she told me. On the lower border, as you mentioned, was woven the pi and the theta on the upper border. And between the two letters, steps were marked like a ladder by which one might climb from the lower letter to the higher. But violent hands had ripped the dress and torn away what bits they could. In her right hand, she carried a book, and in her left, a scepter. So on the one hand, all this detail is giving you this really visual impression, like you have this, it's before your eyes. But you're also you're aware that there's something to be interpreted, right? Those letters mean something. That ladder means something. The ripped clothing even means something, right? And so it doesn't get explicitly unpacked for us, but we're invited to unpack it, which is, an invitation that for some readers is like catnip, right?
Yeah. And the fact that she is of an uncertain height,
mm-hmm,
which is in many ways, or at least for me, is one of the most striking things about this description, which is very calmly, you're looking at a real woman, so to speak, who shows up in your prison cell, and she is of indiscernible height.
Yeah, and sometimes her height seems to actually penetrate the clouds, right? So already you get the sense that this is a thing that is at once real and supernatural, right? It's both in the everyday world and far beyond it. And it's going to oscillate between these two. And Boethius, the prisoner here, is a mess. He can't even really tell what he's looking at. He says, since my sight was so dimmed by tears, I could not clearly see who this woman was, right? And she comes, she talks to him. And then after a little time goes by, and in particular, after he's heard a poem from her, right? Then he can see better. He's improving. So he says, the clouds of misery were dispelled, and I drank in the clear light, recovering enough to recognize my healer's face. So when I looked on her clearly and steadily, I saw the nurse who brought me up, whose house I had from my youth frequented, the Lady Philosophy. So it's a really weird moment, right? So on the one hand, he's looking at her and he's like, oh, whoa, it's my old nurse, right? It's the woman who used to take care of me. But that's also philosophy, right? So it's like real, not real, or real in this world, and then real in this other world, kind of.
But then the first thing he says immediately after that, in the translation that I'm looking at here, I asked her why she had come down from the heights of heaven to my lonely place of banishment. Is it to suffer false accusation along with me? I asked. Like, what? That's how you greet your old nurse?
Oh, he's a mess. He's a mess.
I mean, she's at least a bit more sensible. Like, why, my child, should I desert you? Why should I? Yeah, it's very sweet, but it's just weird. I don't know. I find his reaction to meeting her inexplicable. And he's a mess, but it's more than that, I feel like.
It's kind of neat because it's like this abstract world of philosophy, and yet it's so personal, right? She'll say, do you not think I would come? She said, did I not often of old also before my Plato's time have to battle in mighty struggle with arrogant stupidity? And in his day, was I not beside his teacher Socrates when he won the prize of a martyr's death? Elsewhere, she'll refer to, she's like, my Aristotle. Like she's like, these are her boys.
Yeah. And of course, much like Dante writing himself as recognized and beloved by Virgil and all that, Boethius is more than happy to say, oh yeah, philosophy came to me in my cell and said, you're one of my boys.
Exactly. This is exactly like that moment in Inferno when Dante is down there and he goes to limbo and he says, and they welcome me as one of their number. He says about the poets. And I'm like, oh, Dante, your ego is this big. It's exactly the same.
Yeah. I mean, Boethius's ego isn't I don't know. Is it that big? It
Or
might
no
be.
one's ego is
Well,
the
no,
only
not as
person.
big as Dante's,
I was going to say
obviously.
the only person whose ego is as big as Dante's is probably Milton, but Boethius is at best a pale third, right?
Right.
But it's the same kind of moment. Like he's doing two things, right? One is he's putting himself with them, like not above them, but like with them in their number, as lovers of wisdom, right? They're united through that. I mean, this is what I find so interesting. This affective language, like your nurse who like nourishes you with the milk of her body, who cleans up your boo-boos, right? And puts you to bed and, washes you and everything like that. That is the thing that underlies the work of the philosopher. Like it's just such an affective way of framing it. Remember when we read Plato's Symposium, we talked about the role of love and affective union between people as a means of ascent, right? This is very different from that in some ways, but the affective dimension of philosophical knowledge, that seems to be very similar, which I think is really cool. I like that a lot.
I feel like we've done an interesting tour of this book in that we started with talking about why the ending is so unsatisfying. And we've ended at the beginning and how this is all set up. And what a fun travel through the book.
I think so. I really love this book. And I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's definitely worth dipping into.
Yeah. I mean, especially the first few books of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I have to confess, I myself tune out a little bit in books 4 and 5. Like I just go through for the, the juicy bits, but really books 1 through 3 are the really, really great parts.
Because I couldn't find a satisfying translation of the book, I ended up, I usually listen to an audiobook while reading the text just to make sure my whole mind is engaged as I'm going over this. And this time, I was listening to an audiobook of a different translation from the text that my eyes were going over, which was an interesting experience. And I recommend trying it sometimes if you're into that kind of thing. I wasn't checking the text primarily. Primarily, I was just listening to it while walking around, and it played out like a really interesting, I don't know, fictive text or something, like a My Dinner with Andre or something, or a really chewy podcast or something with two people talking to each other, until we got to the second half of the book when it gets deeply philosophical. And I admit I would occasionally get halfway through a chapter and just be like, okay, yeah, I know where this is going. Let's go. Let's jump ahead. Let's see what's next. And I wonder, like, how do we deal with that? I mean, and I'll lay my cards on the table here. Like, I don't buy the Platonist arguments in this book, right? I don't find a lot of the arguments about, well, the good is this, the good is this, and the infinite or the beginning. Those arguments don't work for me. And this is, true when they show up in Plato and they show up elsewhere. And there's not enough else to hang my hat on in the latter half of this book, other than this unfolding philosophical argumentation. So, like, that distracts me from enjoying any of the other qualities of the book quite a lot, because I'm just furious that the philosophy feels wrong to me.
Yeah. Well, I wonder sometimes. So remember when we did Augustine's Confessions, right? The last few books get very, very, very philosophical, and they're all about like time, and like they get quite abstract. And I wonder sometimes if what's going on here in books 4 and 5 of the Consolation of Philosophy is in some ways kind of analogous to what's going on there, but without the recourse to theology. And the reason I think that is when you're reading books 4 and 5, you get a intricate philosophical explanation of providence. So in book 4, prose 6, he says this: "The way that all things behave," he says, "when they are contemplated in the utter purity of the divine intelligence is called providence. But when related to those things it moves and disposes, like in this world, it was by the ancients called fate. Providence is the divine reason itself, but fate is a disposition inherent in movable things, through which providence binds all things together, each in its proper ordering." He says, "This unfolding of temporal order, being united in the foresight of the divine mind, is providence, and the same unity, when distributed and unfolded in time, is called fate." So you can see how this is a little bit like what Augustine is going to say in those last books of the Confessions, when he's unpacking how it is you can see the difference between what looks like capricious fate in this world, right? Just things happening the way they happen. And then the orderly unfolding of things that we can see happening in terms of providence. And we can only see that when we pull back from linear time, and instead we see the way God sees, from the vantage point of eternity and not in linear time, but in this other kind of domain. And so a little later on, he unpacks this a little bit further. And this is in Book 5, Prose 6. He says, if you should wish to consider his foreknowledge, so God's foreknowledge, by which he discerns all things, you will more rightly judge it to be not foreknowledge as it were of the future, but knowledge of a never-passing instant. And therefore it is not called prevision, praevidentia, but providence, providentia, because it looks forward on all things as though from the highest peak in the world. Just as you see certain things in this, your temporal present, so he perceives all things in his eternal one. Right? So I think in books 4 and 5, what's going on is we're coming up against the limits of philosophy. Right? Remember, she'll say, I can't answer that question because that's a theological question. Like, that's above my pay grade, Boethius, right?
Right.
I think that's what's happening. It's running into the wall that separates, or it's running into the limits of philosophy. And Augustine's not going to have that problem because he's like all in with theology. But the Consolation of Philosophy is going to be like, this is how far we can go.
So that's a perfectly good reading. In fact, that's a better reading than I could have provided for it, for sure. But I guess my question is, like, do you ever find yourself hitting a wall with the philosophy of a text like this, of your agreement with the argumentation it's making? And when you don't find other things to enjoy, like, I don't necessarily buy into what Augustine is saying in those last chapters, but I find them really engaging because he's so viscerally wrestling with himself.
Yeah,
that I can get a sense of he's driving himself into conniptions, trying to answer the question of what is time. And it's such an impossible question that you can just, it's palpable. And that's delightful, even if I don't necessarily agree with or even care about where he ends up. Here, I don't have any of that. I just have what feels like very dry Neoplatonism that I'm not invested in personally, and I don't agree with the logic behind it. I can think of, counterexamples and counter arguments and so forth that this doesn't satisfy me the way it satisfies Boethius. So, like, what do you do when you're reading it as a literary text, or I guess even as a philosophical text, but you're reading it not as an object of study where you're explaining, Boethius's position?
Mm-hmm.
But or maybe that is actually how you approach this. But where you're trying to just, sort of read it as an individual who is reading this today.
Yeah. I guess the place I land is like, he knows he's going to die, right? I mean, it's prison literature, right? He's imprisoned. And there are these two closely related moments where I feel like that comes out in this really poignant way, this like really sad way. There's this one moment when philosophy is like, you have to tell me what's wrong. You have to lay bare the wound. And Boethius says, do you really need to ask? Isn't my harsh treatment at Fortune's hands not obvious enough? Are you not affected by the very appearance of this room?
Lady, read the room. Have you seen the news?
I know. No, but the room is so cool. The room is so cool. He says, did you look at this room? He says, do you not recognize the library, which you once chose for yourself as a secure dwelling place in my house? The very room in which you used to sit with me discoursing on the knowledge of all things human and divine. And then he goes on, more self-indulgent sort of sadness. And this reference to the space that he's in, this library, it's like, in the same way that philosophy is at once his old nurse and this transcendent figure who rises up into the heavens, so too this space is both like a physical room, but it's also like the library of his mind. Like, she's in his mind.
Yeah.
And he's imprisoned, right? He's also in a jail cell, right? He's also in this bad captivity, right? And philosophy will come back to that metaphor a little bit later on in the same book when she says, I am moved more by the sight of you than of this place. I seek not so much a library with its walls ornamented with ivory and glass as the storeroom of your mind, in which I have laid up not books, but what makes them of any value, the opinions set down in my books in times past. So she's like really unpacking this idea that, like, yeah, maybe you're imprisoned, but the room you're in is not this prison that you're in. The room that you're in is this library, right? Which is secret. It's inside of you. And it's this kind of, that's the sense in which I feel like you can read it against prison literature. He's talking about, where do you go when you can't go anywhere? You can go inside. And if you go inside, you'll find philosophy, you'll find these treasures laid up, you'll find the books, you'll find the ivory and glass, you'll find that place you can go to when you can't go anywhere. So I find, like, so that's how I kind of like make sense of it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, and that section is fantastic. I mean, yeah, no, the idea that you're in a library, but the real library is in your mind, and you're in a prison, but the real prison is the one that you've made in your mind because you're not paying attention to philosophy. So let's walk you through that again so that you can think your way out of this. Like, great metaphor. And it does echo with some of the other, it echoes with the autobiography of Malcolm X, which we read a while ago, in which he is in prison at one point, and that's where he learns about it, or learns more deeply about and converts to Islam. And it is similarly, you're in a prison, but that's not the prison that matters.
No.
Right?
No.
And this is an opportunity for him to get out of the one prison so that when he gets out of the sort of literal prison, he is not still in the prison of his mind. That's all fantastic. But yeah, I don't know. I that's the stuff that I like about the book. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's why like, I don't get hung up on like, do I believe the philosophical commitments he's espousing? Because I'm like, this dude is in jail and he's going to die. And this is how he makes sense of the world in order to function.
Sure.
I mean, I may be wrong, but that's the way I kind of rationalize it.
Yeah, it's just whether I should just stop the book early. I should just not read the last couple chapters. There's nothing for me there.
Well, no, but I think that's right. I mean, the last two books are like, I don't know. I mean, they're fine, but the real action is the first three. I totally agree with that. And philosophy is going to tell you that, like, this is a way to kind of lift yourself out. She'll use this beautiful metaphor of like, she says, I'll affix wings to your mind so that it can raise itself aloft so you may return safely to your homeland under my guidance, on my path, and in my carriage. So it's this kind of reassurance that all that time you spent devoted to philosophy, she hasn't forgotten you. Like, she hasn't abandoned you. She's going to be what lifts you up and takes you where you're going, right? Which I find really poignant if you think about his situation.
Well, we could talk about this text some more, for sure. And especially if I sat down and looked at some of the Latin poetry, I'm sure I'd have all sorts of things to say, and we'd bore most of our listeners.
And I just have to say, the Latin poetry is beautiful. It totally repays, for those who are interested in that, it totally repays your time. It's really beautiful.
But we're going to be tackling a fairly different text next time. And it's one of my favorite medieval texts.
Me too.
What a coincidence.
No, we're going to have fun with because sometimes it's different. Sometimes one of us is like, oh, we really want to do this book. And the other one's like, okay.
Indeed.
But I think here we're both in with. Yeah, no. But we're definitely both of us in with both feet.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to be looking at Isidore of Seville's Etymologies, which is going to be a little unfair for those of you who don't know Latin. I'm sorry, you have about a month to learn it. It's not the hardest Latin text in the world, but, still, there is an English translation of it. It is good to have, and I'm very grateful it exists, and we'll be linking to it in the show notes. But this is really a text that makes a lot more sense if you have at least rudimentary Latin. Or
some people may have encountered comparable or related sort of encyclopedic texts from the Middle Ages, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tradition. So we're going to talk about Isidore in particular, but he also gives birth, I guess you could say, or popularizes a way of thinking about the world that's going to be really influential.
Yeah. Oh, it's a real fun book.
Oh, yeah.
But until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/68. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.